Has this ever happened to you? Oh my god, I can't believe I just got killed by the Pharah. It needs to be nerfed. Or this? I'm going to use the MG82 because it's broken and I know it'll get me kills. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I crunched the numbers. I know exactly what you should be using in Call of Duty, and I'm going to explain it to you right now. So you might be wondering what numbers I'm talking about. I went in-game and calculated the average time to kill for 12 of the most popular weapons in Cold War. I also calculated the margin of error for each of these averages. The margin of error will let us know how much recoil each of these guns have in comparison to each other. I'll also be showing a clip of their uncontrolled and controlled recoil at the end of their individual analysis. If none of what I'm saying makes sense, just stick around till the end of the video. There, I'll give a basic rundown of pretty much like what all these numbers mean and which of these guns you should actually be using. So don't worry if it doesn't make any sense. These numbers were not made up. Me and my friend Spencer went into a custom match and tested each gun. We have the times in milliseconds, which is 1/1000th of a second, and in terms of frames, as in video being shown in 60 frames per second. How we did it was 10 kills for each gun, each at a range respectful to its given class. So for SMGs we used a short, kind of mid-range, and for ARs and LMGs we did a bit of a longer range. All 10 kills had to stay below the neck and have continuous fire. All headshots or pauses in shooting were disqualified. All guns are at their base form so that they would be on an even playing field. I'm going to be listing the 12 guns by category, going ARs, SMGs, and LMGs. Going from worst to best. First up, we have the FFAR with an average time to kill of 845 milliseconds or 50.7 frames, a margin of error of 208.33 milliseconds or 12.5 frames, and a reload speed of 2.53 seconds. The fastest recorded kill time was 516.66 milliseconds or 31 frames, and the slowest was 1233.33 milliseconds or 74 frames. The FFAR had the slowest recorded time of any of the 12 guns tested, and this is the worst of the 5 assault rifles in this video, mainly due to its higher recoil. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. Next, we have the C58 with an average time to kill of 750 milliseconds or 45 frames flat, a margin of error of 205 milliseconds or 12.3 frames, and a reload speed of 3.33 seconds. The fastest recorded time was 400 milliseconds or 24 frames, and the slowest was 1016.66 milliseconds or 61 frames. Also due to recoil, the time to kill ends up being higher than the other ARs of this list. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. Next, we have the Pharah with an average time to kill of 558.33 milliseconds or 35.5 frames, a margin of error of 115.83 milliseconds or 6.95 frames, and a reload speed of 3.28 seconds. The fastest recorded time was 416.66 milliseconds or 25 frames, and the slowest recorded time was 866.66 milliseconds. Due to the Pharah's faster TTK and a margin of error, to a more accurate player, the Pharah would actually outperform our number 2 spot. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. Next up, we have the Krig, with an average time to kill of 525 milliseconds or 31.5 frames, a margin of error of only 3.33 milliseconds or 2 frames, and a reload speed of 2.98 seconds. The fastest recorded kill was 433.33 milliseconds or 26 frames, and the slowest was only 633.33 milliseconds or 38 frames. Although the Krig can be outperformed by the Pharah, the Krig has a faster TTK with almost a third of the recoil, therefore it secures our number 2 spot. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. And finally, in our number 1 spot, you guessed it, the XM4. With an average time to kill of 448.32 milliseconds or 26.9 frames, it has the second smallest TTK of all 12 guns, a margin of error of only 28.67 milliseconds or 1.72 frames, our smallest margin of all 12 guns, and a reload speed of 3.66 seconds. The fastest recorded kill time was 399.98 milliseconds or 24 frames, and the slowest time was 499.98 milliseconds or 30 frames. With the lowest recoil of all the ARs and a nice damage output, it is no wonder the XM4 is one of the fan favorites of COD players, and the numbers show us why. It is the most consistent of all 12 guns. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. Next up, we have our SMGs. At the bottom of our SMG list, we have the AK-74U with an average TTK of 623.31 milliseconds or 37.4 frames, a margin of error of 214.99 milliseconds or 12.9 frames, and a reload speed of 2.82 seconds. The fastest recorded kill was 383.32 seconds or 23 frames, and the slowest was 916.63 milliseconds or 55 frames. Although almost everyone loves the AK-74U due to its high recoil among the SMGs affecting its TTK, it ended up being at the bottom of our list. However, more accurate players can cause the AK-74U to beat out our 3rd and 2nd place spot in terms of TTK. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. Next up, we have the MP5 with an average TTK of 536.65 milliseconds or 32.2 frames, a margin of error of 92.66 milliseconds or 5.56 frames, and a reload speed of 2.97 seconds. The fastest recorded kill was 333.32 milliseconds or 20 frames flat, and the slowest was 716.64 milliseconds or 43 frames. Although the MP5 started out as the most overpowered gun in the game and received some heavy nerfs because of it, it remains a worthy contender of our Cold War guns. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. In our number 2 spot, we have the MAC-10 with an average TTK of 473.31 milliseconds or 28.4 frames, a margin of error of 61.33 milliseconds or 3.68 frames, and a reload speed of 2.35 seconds. The fastest recorded kill was 349.99 milliseconds or 21 frames, and the slowest was 583.31 milliseconds or 35 frames. With the time to kill and the margin of error being what it is, an accurate player can cause the time to kill for the MAC-10 to outclass even the XM4, leading it to be one of the most powerful guns in the game. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. In our number 1 spot, I'm sure you guessed this one as well, we have the LC-10. It has an average time to kill of 458.32 milliseconds or 27.5 frames, a margin of error of 68.33 milliseconds or 4.1 frames, and a reload speed of 2.8 seconds. The fastest recorded kill was 283.32 milliseconds or 17 frames, the fastest kill recorded of all 12 guns. That's less than 0.3 of a second. The slowest kill was 583.31 milliseconds or 35 frames. This gun has one of the smallest recoils of all 12 guns, and with a modest ammo count and good mobility, this gun can arguably be labeled overpowered. Whichever way you look at it, the LC-10 is the best SMG and arguably the best gun in Cold War right now. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. Finally, we have our 3 LMGs. I'm sure this is going to be a surprise to some people, but the MG82 is actually the worst stats-wise of the 3 LMGs we tested. It had an average time to kill of 523.31 milliseconds or 31.4 frames, a margin of error of 121.33 milliseconds or 7.28 frames, and a reload speed of 6.73 seconds. The fastest kill was 366.65 milliseconds or 22 frames, and the slowest was 783.3 milliseconds or 47 frames. Although this gun is labeled overpowered by many, it requires above average recoil control to compete with our other two LMGs, which both have about half the recoil and faster time to kills. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. In our second place spot, we have the Stoner, with an average TTK of 453.32 milliseconds or 27.2 frames, a margin of error of 63 milliseconds or 3.78 frames, and a reload speed of only 5.87 seconds. The fastest recorded kill was 333.32 milliseconds or 20 frames, and the slowest was 549.99 milliseconds or 33 frames. This gun beats out the MG82 with its TTK and MOE, not to mention its sleeker design and faster reload speed, which is important when it comes to LMGs. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. In our number one spot comes an LMG we decided to do last minute since we never really see many people use it. The RPD has an average TTK of 408.32 milliseconds or 24.5 frames, the fastest average of all 12 guns, a margin of error of 53.33 milliseconds or 3.2 frames, and a reload speed of 6.77 seconds. The fastest recorded kill was 299.99 milliseconds or 18 frames, only 16.67 milliseconds off of the LC-10's fastest and second fastest of all 12 guns. The slowest kill was 633.31 milliseconds or 38 frames. The RPD ended up surprising us as a powerful, underrated beast. With a fast TTK and a low margin of error, it actually ends up being one of our top contending guns in Cold War. This is the uncontrolled recoil. This is the controlled recoil. Now, after all of these numbers and comparisons and all of that, which gun should you use? If you want to run an AR, here are the two best options. Beginning players or players with average/below average aim should be using the XM4. It has a good time to kill, low recoil, and is the most consistent gun of all 12 that we tested. If you're a more advanced player or have very good recoil control, then you should be using the FARA. Although its average TTK was higher than the Krig and XM4, better accuracy can bring that time from 558.31 milliseconds or 33.5 frames to a whopping 442.48 milliseconds or 26.55 frames, which can outperform the XM4. If you want to run an SMG, here are your best options. Beginning players or players with average/below average aim should be using either the MAC-10 or the LC-10. Both offer low recoil with fast TTKs and are perfect for people of that skill level. If you're a more advanced player or have very good recoil control, then I recommend the AK-74U. Although it's had the slowest TTK and highest recoil of the SMGs tested, getting that recoil under control can bring that time to kill from a 623.31 milliseconds or 37.4 frames to 408.32 milliseconds or 24.5 frames, not only competing with the MAC-10 and LC-10, but with every AR listed as well. Of course, you can't go wrong using the other two MAC-10 and LC-10 SMGs either. If you want to run an LMG, here is the best option. Even though everyone views the MG82 as the most overpowered gun in the game right now, it actually has the worst base stats, and given its eventual second nerf, I wouldn't recommend getting too comfortable with it. On the other hand, even though the RPD ended up coming out on top stats-wise, I wouldn't recommend that one either due to its slower mobility, bulky look, and slower reload speed. Overall, I believe the Stoner ends up being the best option with a good TTK that competes with all ARs and SMGs. This is a good option for beginning players due to its already lower recoil and fast TTK. It becomes even better when paired with veteran players or those with good recoil control, since that will boost the TTK from 453.32 milliseconds or 27.2 frames to about 390.32 milliseconds or 23.42 frames, which beats all AR numbers and is directly on par with a top tier player using an LC10. So those are the numbers. I hope you enjoyed and got something out of this. If you want to see any stats for guns I didn't do, then leave them in the comments below and I can do a part 2 to this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Adios.
Tell me pretty lies, look me in the face, tell me that you love me, even if it's fake.